For a whole generation, on both sides of the Atlantic, an MGB was the first sports car you ever owned. Wind in your hair, a small engine making a cheerful noise, freedom you could just about afford on an ordinary wage. It became the best-selling sports car the world had ever seen. More than 500,000 were built by hand in a single small works at Abingdon, most of them crossing the ocean to America. The mark behind it had survived the Depression. It had survived the loss of its founder and his death. It had survived being swallowed by one giant combine after another and kept building cars that looked fast standing still. And then, after 50 years in that little town, the gates at Abingdon closed and the tracks fell silent. How does the best-selling sports car in the world simply stop? What happened inside those walls? Chapter 1. The sideline that became a mark. There is a car museum on the first floor of a Grade 1 listed building in the market town of Abingdon, and to get one of its exhibits inside, they had to lift an MGB Roadster through an arched Georgian window with inches to spare. That was the 1st of December 2011. The little sports car has sat up there ever since in the old county hall. Tilted in through an arch, it can never easily leave, looking down over a town square that once sent more than 500,000 of its kind out into the world, and now sends none. Start there. Not with the ending, but with the strange fact of a sports car hoisted through a window. Because the story of how it got up there begins nearly a century earlier, and it begins not with a factory, and not with an engine. It begins with a limp. Cecil Kimber walked with one. He damaged a leg badly in a motorcycle accident in his youth, serious enough to leave him with a permanent limp, serious enough to turn him off 2 wheels for life and point him towards 4. It's a small thing, a young man's crash on a country road, but the whole of what follows hangs off it. Had Kimber not come off that motorcycle, there is no reason to think there would ever have been an MG at all. He was born in Dulwich, in South London, in April 1888, and he came up through the motor trade the hard way, working for component makers and coach builders, learning how a car was bodied and trimmed and sold before landing, in 1921, at a modest Oxford business called Morris Garages. It was the retail arm of the empire William Morris was building, the showroom and the service side, the place where you actually bought and got your Morris mended. Kimber came in as sales manager. Within a year or so, he was general manager, and almost at once, he began doing something nobody had asked him to do. He started making the cars better looking. The Morris Oxford of the early 1920s was a decent, honest thing. The bullnose, people called it, after its rounded radiator. It was reliable. It was affordable. It was not, by any measure, exciting. Kimber looked at it and saw what the factory couldn't, that a man might pay rather more for the same mechanical parts if they came wrapped in a prettier, sportier, lower-slung body. So he had a special coachwork fitted, tuned the engines a touch, and sold the results as the Morris Garages Super Sports. They were, when you got down to it, ordinary Morrises in tailored suits, and they sold. Here is the first thing to understand about MG, because it shapes everything that comes after. It did not begin as a factory. It began as a dealer's sideline. A clever, restless man tuning and rebodying other people's cars and stamping his own idea of style onto them. That stamp became a badge. The octagon, the initials of Morris Garages, drawn into an 8-sided shape that would one day be recognised on roads on the far side of the world. The letters MG began appearing in the mid-1920s. The MG car company name came into use around March 1928, and the models multiplied. The 6-cylinder 1880, shown at the London Motor Show that year, a car that gave MG a proper identity of its own, rather than a borrowed one. And at the other end of the scale, the tiny M-type midget, small and cheap and quick, a sports car an ordinary enthusiast could actually afford. That was the trick Kimber kept returning to all his life. The pleasure of a fast car, brought within reach of a person on a normal wage. The sideline had become a mark with a range. It needed room to grow. Over the closing months of 1929, production shifted out of Oxford and down to Abingdon-on-Thames, 6 miles south into part of an old works that had belonged to the Pavlova Leather Company. The name matters, because the smell did. For years afterwards, men arriving for the early shift would catch the ghost of the tannery still hanging in the brickwork, the faint animal reek of a trade that had packed up and moved on, soaked into the walls of the place where they now built sports cars. On the 20th of January 1930, They held an inaugural luncheon to mark the move. William Morris himself came. That July, Kimber was made managing director. For a few short years, he had all of it: the mark he'd invented, the factory it lived in, the freedom to shape it exactly as he pleased. And then, in 1935, it was taken from him. Not violently, not with any drama. Morris, by then Lord Nuffield, one of the richest men in Britain, simply decided that his little sports car sideline ought to be brought under the direct control of Morris Motors. Rationalised, tidied, made to answer to accountants who cared rather more about shared components than about the shape of a wing. Kimber lost his independence at a stroke. The thing he had conjured out of a showroom and an instinct was now just another division reporting to head office. He stayed on, but he never again owned what he had made. His philosophy survived, though, and it's worth hearing, because it explains why people would go on loving these cars for the next half-century. A sports car, Kimber held, should look fast even when it is standing still. Everything Abingdon built carried that instinct in its lines, the sense of forward motion locked into metal that wasn't moving at all. And alongside it ran two words that became the company's promise to anyone who climbed in: safety fast. Kimber's own story does not end kindly, and honesty requires the telling of it. In 1941, after a disagreement with Morris Motors over how the factory's wartime contracts should be organised and financed, he was sacked from the company he had founded. Frozen out a second time, and this time for good. He went on to other engineering work elsewhere. And then, on the 4th of February 1945, with the war all but won, Cecil Kimber was killed in a railway accident at King's Cross Station, when a locomotive lost its footing on a steep gradient out of the platforms and slid back into the carriages behind. He was 56. The man who invented MG did not live to see the car that would carry his octagon around the world, outsell every sports car on earth, and end up lifted through a window into a museum in the very town where he'd built his factory. He never saw any of it, but others did, and they made it go very fast indeed. Chapter 2: Records, GIs, and the American Beginning. To understand how a small English factory came to conquer America, you first have to understand that MG spent the 1930s doing something close to mad. It chased speed records with tiny engines, on banked circuits, on salt, and in the end, on a German autobahn in the last summer before the war. The men who drove those cars are not household names now. What they did still sounds impossible. In 1930, a driver named George Easton took an MG record car called X120 to the banked bowl at Montlhéry, outside Paris, and became the first man to push a 750cc car past 100 miles an hour. Sit with that ratio a moment: an engine smaller than a good many modern motorcycles, hauling a car past the ton. They built a whole reputation on machines like it. One was nicknamed the Magic Midget, and the name fit, because there did seem to be something like conjuring in what those little cars could do. Then came the strangest record of all. A soldier and engineer called Lieutenant Colonel A.T. Gardner, Goldie Gardner to everyone who knew him, took a car called X135, its body drawn out into a smooth aluminium teardrop by the gifted designer Reed Railton, to a stretch of autobahn near Dessau in Germany. It was the 31st of May, 1939. War was 3 months off, and on that German road, Goldie Gardner averaged 203.5 miles an hour over the flying kilometre, the first time a car of roughly 100cc had run anywhere near 200. A tiny British sports car engine passed 200 miles an hour on Hitler's Autobahn in the last weeks of peace. You could not put it in a novel. Nobody would believe you. The mind behind much of MG's cleverness in those years was a quiet, largely self-taught man named Sid Enever. He had joined Morris Garages as a lad, learned his engineering by doing it, and would rise over the decades to chief engineer, the man whose fingerprints sit on every car that matters in this story. Remember him. He is the thread that runs unbroken from the record breakers of the 1930s to the very last car pushed off the line at Abingdon in 1980. The records made MG famous among enthusiasts, and the racing made it respectable. MG at Brooklands, that great concrete saucer in Surrey, MG at Le Mans, and MG taking a class win in the 1933 Mille Miglia, that brutal 1,000-mile road race across Italy that separated the serious drivers from the sentimental ones. And the T-Series road cars carried the reputation to the public. the TA in 1936, then the TB, and after the war, the TC in 1945. Small, spare, hard-riding little roadsters with a fold-flat windscreen and not much at all between the driver and the weather. But it was the war, and what followed it, that turned MG from a famous little marque into something far larger, and it happened almost entirely by accident. Through the war years, Abingdon stopped building sports cars altogether. Car production simply ceased. Instead, the works turned its hands to whatever the country needed, reconditioning Matilda and Carden Lloyd tanks, making tank stowage and ammunition racks, building wing spars for the Hawker Tempest fighter, assembling Lend-Lease lorries that arrived in crates from across the Atlantic. The factory that had chased 200 miles an hour now did the patient, unglamorous, essential work of keeping an army moving. Wives and daughters came in to take the places of men who'd gone to fight, and the twin tracks that had built roadsters built the sinews of war instead. And in doing that work, it met the Americans. American servicemen posted to Britain during and after the war ran into a kind of machine they had simply never encountered at home. A small, cheap, open two-seater that was tremendous, ridiculous, grinning fun to drive. The MGTC was crude by any measure. Narrow, firm, right-hand drive, built on a design that predated the war. But to a GI raised on big, soft American sedans, it was a revelation. The old line, and it's a good one, was that you didn't so much get into an MG as put it on. When these men shipped home, some of them could not bear to leave the cars behind, and took them. Of the roughly 10,000 TCs built, only around 2,000 officially went to the United States, but the influence ran wildly out of proportion to the number. Those little cars seeded sports car clubs and racing all across America. Californian airfield circuits filled up with them. A man who had driven one in Hampshire wanted one in Ohio and told his friends. Within half a decade, the United States had become the largest sports car market in the world, and MG's biggest market by a distance. It would stay that way right to the end in 1980. An English factory's American empire had been founded not by admen or salesmen, but by homesick soldiers and the little cars they couldn't leave behind. MG fed that new hunger with steadily better machines. The MGA arrived in September 1955, and it was a genuinely beautiful thing. A flowing, modern shape designed under Sid Enever, its chassis engineered by a young man named Roy Brocklehurst. It nearly didn't happen at all. BMC's formidable chairman, Leonard Lord, took real convincing that this radical new body was worth putting into production. But into production it went, and around 101,000 MGAs came out of Abingdon, the overwhelming majority of them shipped abroad. The pattern was now set in iron. MG built pretty, affordable, quick little sports cars in a small English town, and the world, America above all, bought very nearly everything the town could make. Everything was in place: the factory, the engineer, the insatiable American appetite. All that remained was for MG to build the car that would define it entirely, the one that would outsell every sports car on the planet, and, in the end, break the hearts of the people who built it. Chapter 3. The happiest factory in Britain. Imagine standing on the works floor at Abingdon on a weekday morning in the mid-1960s. The first thing to strike you, the thing that struck nearly everyone who came through the gates, would be how little it resembled a modern car factory at all. There was no moving assembly line. There never would be. Even in 1980, in its very last year of production, Abingdon had none. The cars were built on twin tracks, running between two decks, and they moved along those tracks because men physically pushed them, shoved each half-finished shell by hand from one workstation to the next. Panels were fettled and offered up and fitted by workers who had done the job for years and could feel through their fingers when a shut line was right. Visitors used to say it was less a production line than a cottage industry that happened, somehow, to turn out tens of thousands of cars a year. A converted leather works in a Berkshire market town, hand-building what would become the best-selling sports car in the world, and doing it more or less the way a good boatyard builds a hull. The man who ran it through most of the golden years was John Thornley, general manager from 1952 to 1969, and an MG man to the marrow. He had loved the marque before he ever drew a wage from it. He had helped found the MG Car Club as a young enthusiast, long before he sat behind the general manager's desk. Under Thornley, with Enever as chief engineer at his side, Abingdon grew a character that everyone who worked there carried with them for the rest of their lives. It was, quite simply, a happy factory. That sounds like sentiment, like the soft gold of hindsight, but it is documented fact rather than nostalgia. Abingdon had the lowest labour turnover and the fewest stoppages of any plant in what would become British Leyland. It never once had an official strike. Set that against the British motor industry of the 1970s, an industry that would soon become a national byword for walkouts and go-slows and bitter grinding disputes, and the little factory at Abingdon stands out like something from another country. It simply got on with the work, and it got on with it better than almost anywhere else in the corporation. The family feeling was not a figure of speech. The workforce was drawn from Abingdon itself and the villages round about, often the same families supplying fathers and sons and cousins across the generations. Wives walked in through the works to pass a message to a husband. The rhythm of the place was a human rhythm, set by people who knew one another's names and one another's people. And down one end of the site sat something that lent the whole place an extra glamour, the BMC competitions department, where the works' rally cars were built and prepared. The comps shop mattered because of what it was winning. Just yards from where the road cars were being pushed along by hand, other men in the same overalls were preparing the cars that beat the world. Because these were the years of the giant-killing Mini Cooper. Paddy Hopkirk, with Henry Liddon reading the notes beside him, took a Mini Cooper S to victory on the Monte Carlo Rally in January 1964, a tiny British economy car humbling far larger, far more powerful machinery on the ice of the Alpes Maritimes. The Finn Timo Mäkinen won the Monte again in 1965. And in 1966, the works' Minis crossed the line first, only to be thrown out of the results over a technicality about their headlamps, a disqualification that still raises the blood pressure of rallymen 60 years on. The comps department ran under a run of shrewd managers, Marcus Chambers, then Stuart Turner, then Peter Browning, and its presence meant the ordinary men building ordinary MGBs did so within earshot of genuine motorsport history, rally engines being warmed and blipped in the yard, the sharp smell of racing fuel and hot oil drifting across the site on the morning air. The car those ordinary men were building, the MGB, was quietly more remarkable than its sweet traditional looks let on. It launched on the 19th of September 1962, and under the pretty skin it was thoroughly modern. Where the MGA had sat on a separate chassis, the MGB used a monocoque, a unitary body shell, lighter and far stiffer, and it was built with a front crumple zone, engineered so the structure would collapse in a controlled, deliberate way to help protect the people inside in a 30-mile-an-hour barrier impact. For an affordable open sports car in 1962, that was genuinely advanced thinking. The drawings carry the name of Don Hayter as designer of record. Enever drove the engineering. Brocklehurst shaped the underpinnings. Between them, this small team built a car that was safer than very nearly anything else you could buy for the money. Hold on to that fact, that the MGB was, from birth, a safety pioneer, because it carries the cruelest irony in the whole story. The car engineered to protect people in a crash would one day be disfigured in the name of crash protection. The very thing it did well became the excuse for the thing that ruined it. But all of that lay years ahead. In October 1965, the MGB was joined by the MGB GT, a fixed-head coupe with a graceful fastback roofline shaped with input from the Italian styling house of Pininfarina. The same charm as the Roadster, now with a hard top and a shade more practicality, a car you could live with all year round. Later came the six-cylinder MGC, and from 1973, the deep-chested MGB GT V8. The range broadened. The reputation broadened with it. Chapter 4, the town that the Octagon built. But a factory is not only a shed full of machines, it is a town's beating heart, and Abingdon knew exactly whose heart it was. At the peak, around 1,400 people worked at the Abingdon plant, a figure the town's own archivists still cite as the high water mark of MG employment. In a market town of that size, 1,400 jobs is not merely an employer, it is the organising fact of the place. It set the hours people kept, the pubs that filled at the end of a shift, the money that moved across the counters of the shops on the Friday the wage packets came. The works and the town were not two things sitting side by side. They were one thing, wearing two names. And what that one thing produced, over 18 years, was staggering for a factory of its modest size. In total, Abingdon built 512,243 MGBs between 1962 and 1980. Of those, 298,052, well over half, were exported to North America. Let those two figures stand next to each other and simply be heard. Once, more than 500,000 cars, and the greater part of them crossing the Atlantic. This was the best-selling sports car in the world, and it would hold that title until the arrival of the Mazda MX-5, a full decade after Abingdon fell silent. Hand-built, no moving line, in a converted tannery, by the most contented workforce in the British motor industry. The MGB became something rare, a sports car for ordinary people, not a plaything for the wealthy, not an exotic kept under a dust sheet in a heated garage, but the affordable dream. The roadster a young schoolteacher could run, a junior doctor could stretch to, an American college student could actually park outside the halls of residence. Wind in the hair, a modest engine making a cheerful noise. The whole promise of a sports car, priced within reach of a person on a normal wage. That was the genius of it, and that was why so many people, on both sides of the Atlantic, remember an MGB as the first sports car they ever owned, the car that taught them what driving could feel like. It slipped into the culture almost without trying. Michael Caine opens the 1972 film Sleuth at the wheel of a flame-red MGB roadster, and the car looks exactly as right as it should. Across the decade, MGs turned up wherever a director wanted to signal a certain kind of freedom, a certain kind of style within an ordinary person's reach. The marque had a knack for the well-known owner that ran back years. A 1960 MGA had appeared alongside Elvis Presley in Blue Hawaii, a car Presley liked so much that he bought it after filming. It sits today in the museum at Graceland. But the MGB's real fame was never in the famous hands that held it. It was in the hundreds of thousands of unfamous ones. It was a car the whole world could afford to love, and a remarkable slice of the world did. Consider what the marque had already lived through by then, because its survival is its own quiet miracle. MG had come through the Depression. It had survived the loss of Kimber's independence in 1935 and Kimber's sacking and Kimber's death. It had survived being folded into the vast British Motor Corporation in 1952, one small, proud name among many. It had kept its character through all of it, kept the octagon, kept the happy floor, kept building cars that looked fast standing still. Whatever the corporate structure above it, however the boxes on the organisation chart were redrawn, Abingdon carried on being Abingdon. You could stand in that town in the late 1960s and believe, reasonably, that it always would. Chapter 5. Hostage to America. Here, though, is the trap, and it was baited with the sweetest possible bait. Success. MG sold something like 80% of its output in the United States. 80%. The fortunes of the factory, the livelihood of the town, the future of every man on that hand-pushed line, all of it rested on the continued willingness of American students and young couples and schoolteachers to keep buying small British roadsters. And for a good long while, they did, in glorious numbers. British Leyland's strongest years in America saw the combined MG, Triumph and Jaguar operation shift around 65,000 cars in 1976 and close to 70,000 in 1977. The showrooms of California and New England and the Midwest were full of British sports cars, and the MGB sat right at the heart of it. But dependence is not security. It only looks like security while the sun holds. The man who understood the American market better than almost anyone inside the company was J. Bruce McWilliams, who ran British Leyland's North American operation, and who would, before the end, fight hard to keep the MGB alive. McWilliams grasped the paradox sitting at the very centre of MG's success, that the things which made it strong were the exact things that would kill it. Each strength was really a hostage given to fortune. The car was cheap, which left almost no margin to absorb a shock. It was export-led, which meant its fate was settled in a currency the factory did not control and could not influence. And it was America-dependent, which meant that when Washington chose to rewrite the rules of what a motor car had to be, a brick factory 6 miles from Oxford had precisely no say in the matter. It could comply, or it could die. The MGB never really controlled its own destiny, the decisions that would blunt its looks, dull its famous handling, and in the end padlock the gates at Abingdon. None of them would be taken at Abingdon at all. They would be taken in American regulatory offices, in the boardrooms of a conglomerate fighting for its life. And, at the last, in Whitehall. The car was a triumph, and the triumph was the noose. Nobody behind those brick walls in 1970 could feel the rope at their throat. The order books were full. The rally cars were winning. Moreland's brewery in the town hadn't yet brewed the ale that would one day carry MG's name into every bar in Britain. The works and the town carried on in the settled, happy rhythm of a place that took it for granted that tomorrow would look much like today, that the hooter would sound, that the shift would come in, that the cars would go on flowing, by hand, towards the docks and the waiting ships and the wide American roads beyond. It would not last, and the first blow would come not as a merger and not as a closure notice, but as something far stranger, a lump of black rubber bolted to the front of the most beautiful car the little factory had ever built. Chapter 6. The Cars That Never Came. The strangest thing about the death of the MGB is that it was never meant to live so long in the first place. It was designed in the late 1950s. It went on sale in 1962, and it was still being built, essentially unchanged in all its fundamentals, in 1980. 18 years. A car conceived under Harold Macmillan, still rolling off the line under Margaret Thatcher. That was not a mark of how good it was. It was a mark of how badly it had been neglected. Because MG did have replacements. That is the part that aches. Twice the factory had a proper successor within reach, and twice the successor was killed. Not by bad luck, but by the peculiar logic of a company that could not see past its own order book. The first was a car called X234. In the mid-1960s, with the MGB barely into its stride, Sid Enever's team worked up a smaller, prettier roadster, bodied by Pininfarina, intended to replace both the midget and the MGB in one clean sweep. It was, by the accounts of those who saw it, lovely, modern, compact, exactly the sort of thing MG would need for the 1970s, and it was shelved, quietly, around 1966. The reasoning was almost insultingly simple. The existing cars were still selling. Why spend money replacing a car that people were queuing to buy? There it is, the trap again, in its purest form. Selling well was the very thing that killed reinvestment. Every full order book was another argument for doing nothing at all. The second lost car was bolder still, a project known as AD021, drawn up around 1970 by the talented Harris Mann, with chassis work by Terry Mitchell, a striking mid-engined design with sophisticated de Dion rear suspension, a genuine leap into the future. And it too died. There was never quite the engine to make it fly, never quite the money, never quite the will. The clay models were wheeled away. The drawings went into a drawer, and the MGB soldiered on, growing older by the year, while its rivals were replaced and modernized all around it. Meanwhile, the ground was shifting beneath the whole enterprise, and the tremors were coming from two directions at once. The first was America. The market MG could not live without, now turning slowly into the thing MG could not survive. From 1968, the United States began tightening its emissions rules year upon year. Engines had to be choked and retuned simply to remain legal. On US market cars, the compression ratio was dropped from 9-1 down to 8-1 in 1972, bleeding away power to meet the law. And looming over all of it, from 1973, came a new federal requirement that a car's bumpers survive a 5-mile-an-hour impact without damage, a rule that was about to collide, head-on, with the low, delicate nose of a sports car designed in the Eisenhower era. The second tremor came from home, and it was structural. In 1968, encouraged by a government keen to forge a British motor champion that could take on the world, Leyland Motors merged with British Motor Holdings to create the British Leyland Motor Corporation, an enormous, unwieldy combine under the leadership of Sir Donald Stokes. At a stroke, MG found itself under the same corporate roof as its oldest and deadliest rival in the sports car business, Triumph. The two marques had spent years trying to beat each other in the American showrooms. Now they were supposed to be family, and in any family with limited money, someone has to be the favourite. MG was not going to be the favourite. The men rising through the sports car side of the new corporation were increasingly Triumph men. They had their own ideas about what the future should look like, and there was no MG anywhere in them. The clouds were gathering. At Abingdon, the work went on as it always had, by hand, along the twin tracks. But the decisions that would decide the factory's fate were already being taken elsewhere, by people who had never fettled a panel or pushed a shell along a deck, and the first of those decisions was about to make itself visible, bolted, in black rubber, to the front of the prettiest car the little factory made. Chapter 7. The Rubber Bumper and the Wedge. It arrived in stages, the way most disfigurements do. In early 1974, US market MGBs appeared wearing large rubber overrider blocks on their chrome bumpers, great black lumps that enthusiasts nicknamed, with grim affection, Sabrinas. That was the warning shot. Then, from September 1974, came the thing itself. Full bumpers of polyurethane molded over a steel armature, front and rear, fitted across every market, home and export alike. Big, soft, black and heavy. Bolted onto a shape that had been drawn with such care to look fast standing still. This was British Leyland's answer to the American 5-mile-an-hour bumper standard, the federal rule that a car's ends had to shrug off a low-speed knock without harm, and it was, on its own narrow terms, the cheapest possible answer. You did not have to redesign the car. You did not have to fund the successor that had already been killed twice. You simply molded a great rubber bar to each end and carried on. There was even a fear, real at the time, that America was about to ban open convertibles outright, and the rubber bumpers were partly a hedge against a market growing ever more hostile to the very idea of an exposed little sports car. But the rubber bumpers alone were not the wound people remember. The wound was what came with them. To meet a separate part of the American regulations, a rule specifying how high off the ground a car's bumpers had to sit, in a defined band of a few inches, British Leyland raised the MGB's entire ride height by about an inch, 25 millimeters. It sounds trivial. It was not. That single inch lifted the car up off its haunches and broke the low-planted, purposeful stance that was central to how the MGB looked, and far worse, to how it drove. The centre of gravity rose. The handling that had made the car a joy on a twisting English lane went soft and vague and top-heavy, and to accommodate the change, the anti-roll bars were deleted in 1974, stripped out entirely, which only made the wallowing worse. So the car grew uglier and it grew clumsier, in the same stroke, for the same reason. To keep an aging sports car legal in the only market that really mattered, without spending the money to replace it. And there was more, all of it pulling in the wrong direction. American emissions law forced the MGB from 1975 to abandon its lovely twin SU carburetors for a single Zenith Stromberg on a combined intake and exhaust manifold. A catalytic converter became standard across all 50 states in 1976, and it had a nasty habit of cracking the very manifold it was bolted to. The figures tell the story with a brutal plainness. An unrestricted British MGB made around 97 horsepower by the old DIN measure. By 1975, the strangled North American car was down to about 62.5 net horsepower. And even by 1980, after some recovery, it had crawled back only to around 67. The caveats matter. A net figure and a DIN figure are not the same thing, and honest comparison needs care. But the direction does not require any caveat at all. The car got slower, year upon year, in the market that bought most of them. The engineers were not fools, and it would be unfair to leave the impression that the later cars were hopeless. In 1977, the anti-roll bars were reinstated, front and rear, a quiet act of restitution, and a rubber bumper MGB set up properly actually handles rather well, as any honest owner will tell you today. But by then the damage to the legend was long done. The car had become a punchline, the MG that lost its soul, and the narrative that began the very day the first black bar was bolted on, that here was a beautiful thing, ruined by regulation and neglect, has never quite gone away, because at its heart it is true. And here is the second fatal decision, the one that ran alongside the first and sealed everything. While the MGB was being disfigured merely to survive, the money that might have saved it was being poured into someone else's car. The corporation had decided, in the years after the 1968 merger, that it would build one corporate sports car, and that car would be a triumph. It was known internally as Project Bullet, and the world would come to know it as the Triumph TR7, the wedge-shaped, angular coupe styled by Harris Mann, the very designer whose MG proposals had been passed over. It was announced in January 1975, built at a new plant at Speke, on Merseyside, and backed with around $11 million of investment, with volume targets meant to swallow the combined sales of the old TR6 and the MGB together, 60 to 70,000 cars a year. The Clay models, the story goes, briefly wore an MG Magna badge before the corporation decided, finally, that the new car should be a Triumph after all. So close. The badge sat on the Clay, and then it came off. The logic ran like this. Because of that feared American ban on convertibles, the corporate sports car was designed from the outset as a fixed-head coupe. No soft top, no exposed occupants, a car built to be legal in a market that might soon outlaw open-topped motoring. One car, in high volume, to replace both the Triumph and the MG, capturing the economies of scale that a fractured British industry so desperately needed. On paper, it was rational. To clear the new car's path, the MGB GT was withdrawn from the American market on New Year's Day 1975, pulled from sale to make room for a Triumph that did not yet exist, and then the fear that justified the whole thing simply evaporated. The American convertible ban never came. It was never enacted. The open sports car remained perfectly legal, which meant British Leyland still needed a roadster to sell in America, and the TR7 would not have a convertible version until 1979. So the MGB, the car the TR7 was built to replace, had to carry on regardless. The two cars ended up chasing the same buyers, inside the same company, cannibalizing one another in the showrooms. Abingdon got no replacement. It got nothing. The men on the twin tracks were now building a car that everyone above them knew had no future. A beautiful old machine, made ugly to stay alive, kept in production only because the car meant to bury it couldn't do the one job the MGB had always done. They were, in the plainest terms, building a dead car. And they knew it. Chapter 8. Whitehall, the boardroom and the axe. By the middle of the 1970s, the question was no longer whether the MGB would be replaced. It was whether British Leyland itself would survive at all. The corporation was hemorrhaging money and losing the country beneath its feet. Its share of the British car market, which had stood at something like 40% in the late 1960s, was sliding towards 18%. Strikes across its many plants were costing sums measured in the hundreds of millions. In 1974 and into 1975, British Leyland simply ran out of cash. And so, in June 1975, the government stepped in and took roughly 95% of the company for an initial $246 million, channeled through the new National Enterprise Board. British Leyland was, in all but name, nationalised. The men on the Abingdon floor now worked at one remove for the taxpayer and for the industry secretary of the day, Tony Benn, who had championed the rescue. The blueprint for what came next was the Ryder Report, drawn up under Sir Don Ryder, a sweeping plan for reorganising the whole sprawling business. It recommended a great deal. Notably, it did not recommend closing plants. That reprieve would not last long, because in November 1977, a new man arrived to run British Leyland, and he was not sentimental about factories. Sir Michael Edwards was a tough, compact South African who had made his name at the Chloride Battery Group, and he had been brought in to do the thing nobody else would dare, to stop the bleeding, whatever the cost in jobs and towns. He halved the board. He broke the business into divisions, and he began, methodically, to close plants. 19 of them out of 55, over his time at the helm. He drove the total workforce down from around 192,000 people towards fewer than 100,000. He renamed the company, plainly, BL. In the cold arithmetic of a firm fighting for its existence, a small factory building an ancient, low-volume sports car was exactly the sort of thing that gets crossed off a list. MG was shuffled between divisions, into Jaguar Rover Triumph, then back towards Austin Morris, a mark without a settled home in a corporation that had run clean out of patience for anything that wasn't the priority small car, the Metro, on which the whole company's future was now being staked. And so we come to the claim, the number that decided Abingdon's fate and that its defenders have disputed ever since. BL's management stated that the factory was running an annual deficit of some $26 million and, more woundingly, that the collapse of the pound against the dollar meant the company was losing around $900 on every single MGB it sold in the United States. £900 a car. Stated flatly, as fact, It was devastating. How do you keep open a factory that loses money on everything it makes? But the men of Abingdon did not accept the figure, and their objection deserves to be heard, because it goes to the heart of whether this factory was truly a failure or was simply made to look like one. John Thornley, retired by then, but still the conscience of the mark, pointed out that Abingdon was only an assembly plant. It bought in its engines and its major components from elsewhere in the corporation, at prices the corporation itself set. By his reckoning, Abingdon added, at most, around $150 to the cost of an MGB. The great loss, if it existed at all, was manufactured largely by the way the corporation chose to allocate its costs and to value its currency. Decisions taken far above the factory floor, in offices where no one had ever pushed a shell along a deck. Even one of the executives responsible, Austin Rover's Harold Musgrove, would later use a different figure again, speaking of a loss of $750 a car. The number shifted depending on who was doing the sum and why. What did not shift was the conclusion it was summoned to justify, and it was a strange factory to condemn as a failure. By BL's own internal measures, Abingdon stood at the very top of the corporation, first for the quality of what it built, and first for the fewest stoppages, with a workforce widely acknowledged as the most loyal in the whole company. It was, on the plain evidence, the best-run plant BL owned. Edwards himself would later admit that he had underestimated the fierce loyalty the MG name commanded. And Musgrove, years afterwards, put it with a rueful honesty. After he had closed the plant that was losing, as he saw it, $750 a car, he understood they had to keep the MG name alive regardless, because of what it meant to people. But that recognition came later, in the quiet of hindsight. In the summer of 1979, all that mattered was the list, and Abingdon was on it. The date was set for Monday, the 10th of September, 1979, and the date itself, it seems, was penciled in by BL's American operations chief, William Pratt Thompson, a man who, by every account, had no idea what else was happening at Abingdon that particular week. He could not have known that he had scheduled the execution for the exact days the factory had chosen to celebrate its own 50th birthday. There was, after that, one last hope, and it is worth telling in full because its collapse is the final, quiet closing of the door. From October 1979, a consortium came forward, led by Alan Curtis, the chairman of Aston Martin Lagonda, and his co-owner Peter Sprague, with backers including the motor auction magnate David Wickens, the businessman Peter Cadbury, and the former minister Lord George Brown among the Norwest group. They were serious men with serious money. They offered BL somewhere around $30 million for the Abingdon plant, the MGB's tooling and design, and the right to go on building the car. They meant it. They commissioned the designer William Townes to restyle the MGB into a 1981 MGB, a prototype, registered DOL 34Y1V, built in a frantic 6 or 7 days by a small team that included Keith Martin and Steve Hallam, and unveiled to the public in June 1980. By that spring, there was even provisional agreement for the consortium to license the MG name. And then the world turned against them. BL was reluctant to sell the MG name outright, wanting to keep it in reserve for a possible MG version of the TR7. The negotiations dragged on, month after month, and while they dragged, interest rates climbed, and the same exchange rate that had helped doom the MGB in the first place now turned on the rescuers too. Aston Martin's own finances were fragile. Its worldwide sales had fallen to something like 3 cars a week. By the summer of 1980, the deal was dead. Thornley, watching the last lifeline part, blamed it, sorrowfully, on the sudden and drastic deterioration of world finance. The rescue that might have saved the factory, and by some reckonings about a third of its jobs, was gone. There was nothing left now between Abingdon and the end. Chapter 9. Black Monday to the last shift. The birthday party came first. For the first week and a bit of September 1979, Abingdon celebrated 50 years of MG in the town, and it did so with everything a small English market town has to give. There were fireworks over the Thames. There was a Jubilee Queen, a young woman named Kim Neal. There was a pram race and a beer race round the pubs and a raft race on the river. Moreland's, the local brewery, brewed a special ale to mark the anniversary, an ale named after an old factory runabout. an experimental MG saloon, whose gold-flecked black paintwork had earned it the nickname the Old Speckled Un. They called the beer Old Speckled Hen. It is still brewed today, sold in pubs the length of the country, and most of the people drinking it have not the faintest idea it began as a factory's 50th birthday toast. On Saturday, the 8th of September, there was a carnival parade through the town, and at the head of it, a collector named Sid Beer drove Old Number 1, one of the oldest and most treasured MGs in all the world, through the bunting-strung market square. The red arrows flew over. The whole town turned out into the September sun. 50 years of building sports cars, and the people who had built them stood and cheered. They did not know they were attending a wake. 2 days later, on Monday the 10th of September 1979, British Leyland announced that it would close the Abingdon works. The announcement was a 4-page statement, part of a wider plan to shed 25,000 jobs across the corporation, ceasing car assembly at Canley and at Abingdon. The MG mark would be retained, the statement said. The factory would become an extension of Cowley, and the justification was the number, the $26 million deficit, the 900 lost on every American car. The way the news reached the people it concerned was, somehow, the cruelest part of all. The memo had been printed at the Nuffield Press, over at Cowley, and it was distributed so haphazardly that Abingdon, the factory it was actually about, heard late. The plant's own director, Peter Frierson, had no warning it was coming. And so some of the men who had spent the previous weekend celebrating 50 years of MG first learned that their factory was doomed, not from their managers, not from any official word, but from reporters, journalists from the Oxford Mail and from Radio Oxford, who had got hold of the leaked story, turned up at the works gates and asked the workers coming off shift how they felt about the closure. That was how they found out, ambushed at their own gates, days after their own celebration, by a stranger with a notebook, asking them to comment on the end of their working lives. The word that came back off the shop floor was utter disgust. But Abingdon did not go quietly, and this is the part worth honouring, because the men and women of MG and the people who loved the cars fought. John Thornley, in retirement, orchestrated a letter-writing campaign among the dealers. American dealers, facing the loss of the car that filled their showrooms, threatened legal action. There was a Save the MG march through London, and a petition, and it was handed in by John Cook, born John Kimber, the daughter of the man who had invented the mark, closing a circle that had opened half a century before in an Oxford showroom. There was a debate in the House of Commons. For a mark so small, the noise it made in dying was enormous. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. But it was made, and it should be remembered that it was made. The dyeing itself took a little over a year. Production was wound down through 1980, from around 600 cars a week, down to 381. Men went on to 3-day weeks. More than 700 assembly workers were laid off as the tracks slowed and slowed. The midget, the MGB's little sister, ended in 1979. The MGB itself was granted 1 more year, and then it too came to the end. The last genuine MGB assembled at Abingdon was not one of the glamorous special editions. It was a plain white roadster, built for export to Japan. It came off the line on the 22nd of October 1980. Think about that. The best-selling sports car in the world. 500,000 cars. 50 years of a mark. And the final one, down the twin tracks, was an ordinary white car bound for the other side of the earth. No fanfare that mattered. No ceremony worthy of the name. Just the last shell, pushed by hand along the deck. Exactly the way every single one before it had been pushed, in a factory that already knew it was finished. The tracks fell silent. The works formally closed on the 24th of October, 1980. 50 years, near enough to the week, after William Morris had sat down to that inaugural luncheon in the January of 1930. The tannery ghost smell in the brickwork, the rally cars in the yard, the wives walking in with messages, the happiest factory in the British motor industry. All of it. Over. Chapter 10. Which one was the last? There is a small mystery at the very end of the MGB story, and it turns out to hold the whole story inside it, the tale of a great mark killed off not cleanly, but in a muddle. Ask which car was the last MGB, and you will get 3 different answers, all of them correct, depending on precisely what you mean. There was the last genuine assembly, the white Japanese export roadster of the 22nd of October. There was a car staged the following day, the 23rd, for a publicity photograph. The aged Sid Enever, the engineer whose career reached all the way back to the record breakers of the 1930s, standing beside John Thornley, the general manager who had loved MG the whole of his life. The two of them posed with a last car for the cameras. And there was the formal closure, on the 24th. 3 dates, 3 last cars. The confusion was real, and it happened because the special edition run-out cars had been completed earlier and then restaged onto the line, after true production had already stopped, purely for the photographs. The Mark historian David Knowles has documented the staging carefully. The model was not a trick of failing memory. It was there at the time. The run-out special editions themselves are worth getting right, because the story is so often told wrong. In Britain, the final MGBs were a limited edition run of exactly 1,000 I1 cars, 580 GTs finished in a pewter metallic, and 421 Roadsters in a bronze metallic, with red octagon badges, a front spoiler, body-side decals, and striped deck-chair-style seats. Separately, and this is precisely where the confusion creeps in, there was a distinct North American limited edition, and that one was black with silver stripes, of which some 6,682 were built across 1979 and 1980. Bronze and pewter for home, black for America. 2 different farewells, for 2 different markets, forever getting mixed up in the retelling. The final American car of all, number 523,000, was presented to Henry Ford II, handed over by Graham Whitehead of Jaguar Rover Triumph, and put on display at the Henry Ford Museum. An English sports car, enshrined in the temple of the man whose Model T had once put the whole world on wheels, and one of those last roadsters, preserved by British motor heritage, is the very car that now sits in the first-floor gallery of Abingdon County Hall Museum, the one lifted in through the Georgian window in December 2011, tilted on its side to clear the arch, wheeled into a room it will most likely never easily leave. 3 last cars, no single ending. A mark that had outsold every sports car on Earth, seen out not with one clean final moment, but with a staged photograph, a publicity model, and a plain white car quietly bound for Japan. Even in death, Abingdon was let down by the people running it, and the confusion is not a footnote. It is the point. It is exactly how the whole thing ended, in a corporation that never quite understood what it had, right up to the moment it threw it away. Chapter 11. What remains at Abingdon. More than 700 assembly workers had been laid off as the tracks wound down to silence. A workforce that had for 50 years been the most loyal and the most contented in the whole of the British motor industry, dispersed. Fathers and sons who had built cars in the same shop, side by side, sent home. The town that the Octagon built had lost the very thing it had been built around. The mark itself did not quite die. The Octagon reappeared in 1982, bolted onto the boot of an MG Metro, a badge on a small hatchback, badge engineering of a kind that would have made Kimber wince, but the name lived on. There was an MG Maestro, an MG Montego. In the 1990s came something closer to the old spirit, the MG RV8, a low-volume roadster built on heritage body shells, around 2,000 of them, and then, in 1995, the genuinely new, mid-engined MGF. Proof, at last, that MG could still build a proper sports car when it was allowed to. But the company that made them, MG Rover, collapsed in 2005. The remains were sold to Nanjing, and then absorbed into the giant Chinese group SAIC. Today, MG is a Chinese-owned brand, and it sells, for the most part, electric cars. Competent, affordable, and utterly unlike anything ever pushed by hand along a deck at Abingdon. The badge a Dulwich man drew for an Oxford showroom now glows on the tailgates of electric crossovers built thousands of miles from Berkshire. The name endured. What it meant did not. The factory itself outlasted its work by 17 years. The old building stood through the 1980s and into the 1990s, until, in 1997, the last major structure, a block, was pulled down. On the site today, off the Markham Road, there are houses. There is a building that served for years as a police headquarters. There is, of all things, a McDonald's near the entrance, where the twin tracks ran, where the rally minis were prepped, where the tannery smell hung in the old brick, an ordinary English street scene now, indistinguishable from 10,000 others, marked by a heritage plaque that most people walk straight past without reading. But the town has not forgotten, and this is the part that lifts the story clear of pure elegy. Abingdon still knows itself as an MG town. Kimber House, in Cemetery Road, remains the home of the MG Car Club to this very day, and there are people who have made it their business to keep the memory concrete rather than merely sentimental. Jackie Smith, an honorary archivist for the town council, who holds the numbers and the dates so that they cannot slip away. A retiree named Bob Frampton, who has gathered the memories of the men who worked there before those memories go into the ground with them. A man named Joe Jackson, who saved the works gate sign itself and passed it to the car club so that the words that once hung above the entrance did not end their days in a skip. And on club nights and on the anniversaries, the cars come back, MGBs, chrome-bumpered and rubber-bumpered alike, because the enthusiasts long ago forgave the rubber, gather in the town where they were built, driven by people who love them, a great many of whom will tell you that an MGB was the first sports car they ever owned. So this is what remains: a car in a museum, hoisted through a window, a plaque on a housing estate, a club in an old house named for a man who was twice frozen out of his own creation and killed before he could ever see what it became, a Chinese badge on an electric car, and a pint of old speckled hen pulled in a pub somewhere tonight, its drinkers mostly unaware that the name is a memorial, that it was first brewed to toast 50 years of a factory that, 2 days after the toast, was told it would close. The MGB was not destroyed by one mistake. The rubber bumpers were the wound you could see. The moment a beautiful thing was made plain, and everyone watching understood that something, somewhere, had gone badly wrong. But the truth is longer and sadder than any single bad decision. A car kept alive far too long because it sold too well to be worth replacing. A rival marque favoured over it. A successor twice killed in the drawing office. A market that turned slowly from blessing into curse. A company that ran out of money and out of mercy. And a rescue that failed at the last as the world's finance turned cold. Not through one mistake. Through a long chain of reasonable-sounding decisions, each one taken far from the twin tracks at Abingdon, each one moving the little factory an inch closer to silence, until the last white roadster was pushed off the line by hand, and, on the Monday, nobody came in to build another.